November 18, 1943, 22,000 feet above the industrial heartland of Mannheim, Germany. Captain Heinrich Volker adjusted his oxygen mask and peered through the armored glass of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, watching what appeared to be another routine interception unfold. Below him, stretched across the crystalline morning sky, a formation of 32 American heavy bombers droned eastward with mechanical precision, their aluminum wings catching the pale sunlight like scattered coins against the deep blue canvas of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Volker had done this dance 43 times before. The ritual was always the same. American bombers would appear on the horizon, flying straight and predictable, defended only by the sparse, intermittent fire from a handful of machine gun positions. His squadron would sweep down from altitude, make their attack runs with calculated precision, and watch as another formation of flying fortresses or Liberators would begin their inevitable descent toward the earth, trailing smoke and the desperate prayers of dying airmen. What Captain Volker didn't know, as he signaled his wingman and prepared to initiate their standard attack pattern, was that the formation below represented something unprecedented in aerial warfare. Each of those bombers bristled with 13 separate machine gun positions, creating a web of interlocking fire zones that would transform the sky itself into a killing field. The Americans had quietly revolutionized bomber defense, and the Luftwaffe was about to discover just how deadly that revolution would prove. The morning had started like any other at Jagdgeschwader 77's base near Frankfurt. Volker had awakened to the familiar sounds of Daimler-Benz engines warming up on the flight line, the metallic clatter of ammunition being loaded, and the terse radio chatter of controllers tracking the incoming American raid. Intelligence reports indicated a moderate formation of heavy bombers, likely B-17s, heading toward the synthetic oil facilities at Ludwigshafen. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested this would be the day that would fundamentally alter German assumptions about American bomber capabilities. The Luftwaffe pilots of late 1943 had every reason for their supreme confidence. Men like Captain Heinrich Volker, Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, and Major Friedrich Steinbach had spent months perfecting the science of bomber destruction. They had studied American formations with the methodical precision of university professors, identifying weaknesses, calculating approach angles, and developing tactics that exploited every flaw in Allied defensive thinking. The standard American combat formation in early 1943 had been a relatively simple affair. Bombers flew in loose groupings of 12 to 18 aircraft, each mounting between 6 and 9 defensive machine gun positions. The theory behind these formations was sound enough: concentrate enough firepower to deter fighter attacks while maintaining the flexibility to adjust course and altitude as tactical situations demanded. In practice, German pilots had quickly learned to exploit the numerous blind spots and ammunition limitations that plagued these early defensive arrangements. Captain Volker had personally developed what his squadron called the Midnight Express attack, named for its devastating effectiveness when executed from the bomber's 6 o'clock position. The technique involved approaching from directly behind and slightly below, using the bomber's own engines and fuselage to mask the attacking fighter until the last possible moment. Most American tail gunners, isolated in their cramped positions and blinded by the glare of their own engine exhausts, never saw the attack coming until cannon shells began tearing through aluminum skin and vital systems. The mathematics of these early encounters heavily favored the attacking fighters. A typical B-17E, or early F model, carried approximately 6,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition distributed among its various gun positions. Against a determined fighter attack, this ammunition could be exhausted in less than 4 minutes of sustained firing. German pilots quickly learned to make multiple passes, forcing American gunners to expend their ammunition on early, ineffective shots, then closing for the kill when defensive fire slackened. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, flying from the same base as Volker, had perfected a different approach entirely. Where Volker preferred the stealth of rear attacks, Brenner had mastered the head-on assault that exploited the limited forward firing capability of early American bombers. His technique involved diving from high altitude, approaching the formation head-on at a combined closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour, and firing a concentrated burst at the lead bomber's cockpit and engines before breaking away vertically. The psychological effect of Brenner's attacks was often more devastating than the physical damage. American bomber crews, watching a Messerschmitt diving directly at their aircraft with guns blazing, frequently broke formation or took evasive action that disrupted the entire defensive pattern. Once the tight formation discipline collapsed, individual bombers became easy prey for the follow-up attacks that Brenner's wingmen delivered with methodical precision. Major Friedrich Steinbach, the group's tactical innovator, had developed what he called the carousel formation. This involved 4 fighters approaching the bomber formation from different quadrants simultaneously, creating multiple threats that overwhelmed the Americans' ability to coordinate defensive fire. While bomber gunners frantically swiveled their weapons between targets, trying to engage 4 separate attackers at once, at least 2 of the German fighters could typically press home devastating attacks without facing effective return fire. The success of these tactics was reflected in the grim statistics that accumulated through the summer and early fall of 1943. During the second Schweinfurt raid in October, German fighters had destroyed or damaged nearly a quarter of the attacking bomber force. The first Regensburg mission saw similar devastation, with American losses reaching unsustainable levels that forced temporary suspension of deep penetration raids into German territory. German pilots began referring to unescorted American bomber formations as fly-in coffins, and their confidence in the superiority of German aviation technology and tactics reached its absolute peak during this period. Intelligence reports suggested that American morale among bomber crews was approaching the breaking point, with some units reporting mission refusal rates exceeding 20%. The technical specifications of German fighter aircraft in late 1943 seemed to confirm this tactical superiority. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 that Volker flew was armed with a 30mm Mk108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by 2 13mm MG131 machine guns mounted above the engine. This concentrated firepower could deliver devastating damage in short bursts, often requiring only a few hits to bring down a heavy bomber. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means the Focke-Wulf 190A6, flown by pilots like Brenner, mounted an even more impressive array of weapons. 4 20mm MG151 cannon and 2 7.92mm MG17 machine guns. The combined weight of fire from these weapons could literally saw the wing off a B-17 in a sustained burst, and German pilots had learned to concentrate their attacks on critical structural points where maximum damage could be achieved with minimum ammunition expenditure. What made German confidence particularly strong was their detailed understanding of American bomber vulnerabilities. Through combat experience, examination of downed aircraft, and interrogation of captured airmen, Luftwaffe intelligence had compiled comprehensive dossiers on every variant of American heavy bomber. They knew that B-17E models carried only 5 defensive gun positions with significant blind spots below the fuselage and forward of the wings. They understood that ammunition supplies were limited and that sustained combat could exhaust defensive capabilities within minutes. The German pilots' tactical doctrine was built around exploiting these known weaknesses with surgical precision. Fighter formations would approach American bombers with the same methodical planning that ground forces applied to attacking fortified positions. Each pilot knew his specific role, his assigned target within the bomber formation, and his escape route once the attack was completed. Training exercises at German fighter schools had evolved to specifically prepare pilots for bomber interception missions. Mock battles were fought against formations of captured or obsolete aircraft configured to simulate American defensive arrangements. German pilots practiced their attack runs repeatedly until they could execute them with mechanical precision, even under the stress of combat conditions. The confidence of German pilots was further reinforced by their success rates against American formations throughout 1943. Experienced pilots like Major Steinbach regularly achieved multiple kills in single missions, with some claiming as many as 4 or 5 bombers destroyed in a single engagement. These statistics were not mere propaganda. They reflected the genuine tactical advantage that German fighters enjoyed when facing the relatively primitive defensive systems of early American bomber formations. Fighter pilot memoirs from this period reveal an almost casual attitude toward bomber interception missions. Captain Volker's personal log, preserved in German aviation archives, describes bomber attacks in terms typically reserved for routine training exercises. The entries reflect supreme confidence in German tactical superiority and a genuine belief that American bomber offensive could be defeated through application of superior flying skill and proven attack techniques. The social dynamics within German fighter squadrons during this period also reflected this confidence. Veteran pilots like Volker and Brenner had achieved near-celebrity status within the Luftwaffe, their success stories circulating through fighter bases across Germany. Young pilots arrived at operational units eager to emulate the tactics and achievements of these bomber-killing specialists. German aircraft designers and engineers shared this confidence in their technological superiority. The latest variants of the Bf 109 and FW 190 incorporated lessons learned from combat against American bombers, with improved armament, better armor protection for pilots, and enhanced high-altitude performance. These improvements seem to confirm that German aviation technology was advancing faster than American defensive capabilities. Intelligence assessments from German Air Force headquarters during this period consistently predicted that sustained losses would force the Americans to abandon daylight precision bombing in favor of less effective night operations. The mathematical calculations seemed irrefutable. If German fighters could maintain their current success rates, American bomber losses would reach levels that no Air Force could sustain indefinitely. What German pilots and planners failed to anticipate was the massive industrial and technological effort underway in American factories and design bureaus. While German fighters were perfecting their tactics against existing American bomber variants, American engineers were developing revolutionary improvements in bomber defensive systems that would transform the fundamental dynamics of air combat over Europe. The B-17G Flying Fortress, which would begin appearing over German targets in late 1943, represented a quantum leap in defensive capability that German intelligence had failed to detect or properly assess. Where earlier variants had mounted 6 or 7 machine gun positions, the new model bristled with 13 separate defensive stations, each manned by experienced gunners and supplied with vastly increased ammunition loads. But on that clear November morning in 1943, as Captain Volker prepared to lead his squadron against what appeared to be another routine American bomber formation, none of these developments were yet apparent. The bombers below looked identical to dozens of others that German fighters had successfully engaged and destroyed. Their formation patterns seemed familiar, their flight characteristics predictable. The trap was perfectly set, though neither side yet realized it. German pilots approached with the supreme confidence born of months of successful combat, while American bomber crews flew in formations specifically designed to exploit that confidence and transform it into a fatal miscalculation. The morning sun continued its climb across the European sky, casting long shadows from the aircraft below as 2 aviation technologies, 2 tactical philosophies, and 2 national approaches to aerial warfare prepared to collide in a confrontation that would fundamentally alter the balance of air power over Nazi Germany. Part 2. The Awakening. The first indication that something had fundamentally changed came not from visual observation, but from the distinctive sound that filled Captain Volker's cockpit as his squadron initiated their standard attack approach. Instead of the familiar, sporadic chatter of defensive machine gun fire that had characterized previous bomber engagements, the air around his Messerschmitt erupted into a continuous roar of overlapping gunfire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Tracer rounds streaked past his canopy in patterns unlike anything he had encountered in 43 previous bomber intercepts. Where American defensive fire had previously been concentrated in specific sectors, creating predictable safe zones that experienced German pilots could exploit, the sky now blazed with an intricate web of intersecting fire lanes that left no apparent avenue of approach undefended. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, flying as Volker's wingman, was the first to experience the deadly reality of this new American defensive capability. As he executed his signature head-on attack dive, approaching the lead bomber at the devastating combined speed that had made him one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber destroyers, he suddenly found himself flying through a corridor of machine gun fire so intense that his aircraft began registering hits before he had even aligned his gun sight on the target. The B-17G flying fortress that Brenner was attacking mounted not the 7 defensive positions he expected, but 13 separate machine gun stations, each manned by highly trained gunners who had spent months perfecting their coordination and fire discipline. The nose position alone now carried twin .5 caliber machine guns instead of the single weapon of earlier variants, doubling the forward firing capability that had previously been the bomber's weakest defensive sector. As Brenner's Focke-Wulf 190 closed the distance to the American formation, gunners in the chin turret, nose position, top turret, and both waist positions opened fire simultaneously, creating a cone of converging bullets that filled the entire approach corridor. The mathematical probability of survival in such concentrated fire was approaching 0, but Brenner, committed to his attack run by speed and momentum, had no choice but to continue forward into what had become a mechanical execution. The first 50 caliber bullets struck Brenner's engine cowling at precisely 0947 hours, sending fragments of aluminum and steel spinning away from his aircraft like deadly confetti. The second burst, fired by the bomber's newly installed chin turret gunner, walked across his wing route and into the cockpit area, shattering the armored glass windscreen and sending razor-sharp splinters into his flight suit and exposed skin. Major Friedrich Steinbach, leading the second element of the attack formation, watched in stunned disbelief as Brenner's aircraft began trailing white coolant vapor, then black smoke, then the orange flames that signaled catastrophic engine failure. The Focke-Wulf, which moments before had been diving with lethal purpose toward its target, suddenly broke into an uncontrolled spiral, its pilot either dead at the controls or desperately fighting to maintain consciousness as his aircraft disintegrated around him. But Steinbach's shock at witnessing Brenner's destruction was immediately superseded by his own desperate struggle for survival as multiple gun positions on 3 separate bombers began tracking his approach with deadly precision. The Americans had somehow solved the fundamental problem that had plagued bomber defensive systems since the beginning of the war: the inability to concentrate sufficient firepower on a single attacking fighter while maintaining coverage of all approach sectors. The solution, which German intelligence had completely failed to detect during its development and testing phases, involved not just the addition of more gun positions, but a revolutionary approach to defensive coordination that transformed each bomber from an individual fighting unit into a node in an integrated defensive network. American gunners had trained extensively in techniques that allowed multiple aircraft to concentrate their fire on single targets while maintaining overlapping coverage zones that eliminated the blind spots German pilots had learned to exploit. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the belly of the lead B-17G, had a clear view of Steinbach's approach and began firing controlled bursts that forced the German pilot to alter his attack angle. This slight course correction brought him directly into the firing solution of the waist gunners on 2 adjacent bombers, whose training now included specific techniques for engaging targets that other aircraft had maneuvered into their kill zones. Steinbach found himself flying through a 3-dimensional maze of tracer fire that seemed to anticipate his every evasive maneuver. Each time he adjusted his flight path to avoid fire from one gun position, he inadvertently flew into the prepared firing solution of another. The Americans had somehow transformed individual defensive positions into components of a single integrated weapons system that covered the entire airspace around their formation with lethal efficiency. The technical revolution that enabled this defensive transformation had begun months earlier in American aircraft factories, where engineers had completely redesigned the internal layout of the B-17G to accommodate nearly double the defensive armament of previous variants. The new chin turret mounted beneath the nose section eliminated the forward blind spot that German pilots like Brenner had exploited with devastating effectiveness. Twin 50 caliber machine guns in this position could engage head-on attacks with the same firepower that earlier bombers could only bring to bear on targets approaching from the side or rear. The redesigned waist positions featured staggered windows that eliminated the previous problem of gunners interfering with each other's fields of fire. Instead of two gunners crowding the same small compartment and frequently blocking each other's shots, the new configuration allowed each waist gunner to operate independently while maintaining overlapping coverage zones that created a continuous barrier of defensive fire along the bomber's flanks. Perhaps most significantly, the ammunition capacity for each gun position had been dramatically increased. Where earlier B-17 variants carried approximately 500 rounds per gun, the G-model bombers bristled with positions supplied with 750 to 1,000 rounds each. This increase in ammunition load meant that American gunners could sustain intensive defensive fire for extended periods without the ammunition exhaustion that German pilots had learned to exploit in prolonged engagements. The training revolution that accompanied these technical improvements had been equally comprehensive. American bomber crews now spent weeks in specialized gunnery schools where they learned to function as integrated defensive teams rather than individual gunners protecting separate sectors of their aircraft. Mock combat exercises pitted bomber formations against simulated fighter attacks that duplicated German tactical techniques with exact precision. Gunners learned to communicate target information instantly through intercom systems, allowing rapid concentration of fire on the most dangerous threats while maintaining coverage of all approach sectors. The bombardier, navigator, and even radio operator had been trained in basic gunnery techniques and could operate defensive weapons when primary gunners were wounded or killed in combat. Captain Volker, still leading what remained of his squadron after Brenner's destruction, found himself facing a tactical situation for which no German training had prepared him. Every approach angle that intelligence had identified as viable was now covered by concentrated defensive fire from multiple gun positions. Every blind spot that German pilots had learned to exploit had been eliminated through careful aircraft redesign and tactical innovation. His first attack run, executed with the same precision that had destroyed 17 previous American bombers, resulted in his Messerschmitt taking hits from at least 4 separate gun positions before he could bring his own weapons to bear on the target. Cannon shells from his Mk-108 struck the bomber's wing and fuselage, causing visible damage but failing to achieve the catastrophic destruction that similar hits had produced against earlier American variants. The B-17G had been reinforced with additional armor protection around critical systems, and its structural design incorporated lessons learned from examination of damaged aircraft that had returned from previous missions. Systems redundancy meant that damage to individual components rarely resulted in immediate aircraft loss, and self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that had doomed so many earlier bombers. Volker's wingman, Unteroffizier Hans Müller, attempted to exploit what appeared to be a gap in the defensive coverage by attacking from below and behind, approaching through the traditional blind spot that German pilots had used successfully throughout 1943. The ball turret gunner, however, had a perfect view of this approach and opened fire at maximum effective range, forcing Müller to begin evasive maneuvers that ruined his firing solution and brought him into the engagement zone of the tail gunner. The coordination between these two gunners, trained through hundreds of hours of practice exercises, was flawless. As Müller maneuvered to avoid the ball turret's fire, he flew directly into a trap that the tail gunner had prepared by holding fire until the German fighter was committed to a specific flight path. The result was devastating. 50 caliber bullets walked across Müller's engine compartment, severed critical control cables, and shattered his canopy in a shower of aluminum fragments and glass. Müller's aircraft, its engine seized and controls partially severed, entered an uncontrollable dive that would end in a crater beside a small German village, whose residents would spend the afternoon searching for recognizable pieces of the young pilot who had awakened that morning confident in his tactical superiority over American bomber formations. The mathematical transformation of air combat was becoming brutally apparent to the surviving German pilots. Where previous bomber formations had been able to concentrate perhaps 20 to 30 machine guns on attacking fighters, these new American formations could bring 60 to 80 weapons to bear simultaneously.
The increase in defensive firepower represented not a gradual improvement, but a quantum leap that fundamentally altered the probability calculations on which German tactical doctrine was based. Major Steinbach, having witnessed the destruction of 2 of his pilots in less than 3 minutes of combat, attempted to rally the surviving members of his squadron for a coordinated attack that might overwhelm the American defensive systems through sheer numbers and simultaneity. German tactical doctrine held that concentrated attacks by multiple fighters could saturate defensive capabilities and allow at least some attackers to penetrate to effective firing range. This doctrine had proven successful against earlier American bombers whose limited ammunition supplies and restricted fields of fire could be overwhelmed by determined attacks from multiple angles. Against the new defensive systems, however, the mathematics had changed completely. Each bomber now carried sufficient ammunition to engage multiple targets for extended periods, and the overlapping coverage zones meant that concentrated attacks simply presented more targets to an integrated defensive network that had been specifically designed to counter such tactics. Major Steinbach, having witnessed the destruction of 2 of his pilots in less than 3 minutes of combat, attempted to rally the surviving members of his squadron for a coordinated attack that might overwhelm the American defensive systems through sheer numbers and simultaneity. German tactical doctrine held that concentrated attacks by multiple fighters could saturate defensive capabilities and allow at least some attackers to penetrate to effective firing range. This doctrine had proven successful against earlier American bombers whose limited ammunition supplies and restricted fields of fire could be overwhelmed by determined attacks from multiple angles. Against the new defensive systems, however, the mathematics had changed completely. Each bomber now carried sufficient ammunition to engage multiple targets for extended periods, and the overlapping coverage zones meant that concentrated attacks simply presented more targets to an integrated defensive network that had been specifically designed to counter such tactics. American gunners had trained extensively in techniques that allowed multiple aircraft to concentrate their fire on single targets while maintaining overlapping coverage zones that eliminated the blind spots German pilots had learned to exploit. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the belly of the lead B-17G, had a clear view of Steinbach's approach and began firing controlled bursts that forced the German pilot to alter his attack angle. This slight course correction brought him directly into the firing solution of the waist gunners on 2 adjacent bombers, whose training now included specific techniques for engaging targets that other aircraft had maneuvered into their kill zones. Steinbach found himself flying through a 3-dimensional maze of tracer fire that seemed to anticipate.
The 4 surviving German fighters approached the bomber formation in a coordinated attack pattern that had destroyed dozens of American aircraft during previous missions. Steinbach led from the left front quarter, while his wingman approached from the right. The second element attacked from below and behind, timing their approach to arrive simultaneously and divide the bombers' defensive attention among multiple threats. The result was carnage that exceeded even the Americans' expectations of their new defensive capabilities. 13 machine gun positions on the lead bomber alone opened fire within seconds of each other, creating a volume of bullets so intense that the air itself seemed to become solid. The overlapping fire from adjacent bombers added dozens of additional weapons to the defensive barrage, transforming the entire airspace around the formation into a killing zone that no aircraft could survive. Steinbach's Messerschmitt absorbed hits from at least 6 different gun positions before he could fire a single shot at his target. His aircraft's wing structure, designed to withstand the stresses of high-speed maneuvering and moderate battle damage, simply disintegrated under the concentrated impact of dozens of .5 caliber bullets. The Bf-109G, which had been one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world when it took off that morning, became a falling collection of aluminum fragments and burning aviation fuel. His wingman lasted approximately 15 seconds longer, not because of superior piloting skill or aircraft durability, but simply because the American gunners required that much additional time to shift their fire from Steinbach's disintegrating aircraft to the next target in their carefully rehearsed engagement sequence. The destruction was methodical, precise, and absolutely devastating in its efficiency. The second element of the German attack formation never reached effective firing range. The combination of defensive fire from multiple bombers and the psychological impact of watching their squadron commander and his wingman destroyed in seconds broke their attack formation before they could engage their targets. Both pilots broke off their attack runs and fled eastward, their aircraft damaged but still flyable, carrying news of this tactical revolution back to Luftwaffe headquarters. Captain Volker, the only pilot from his squadron to survive the encounter intact, found himself alone in the sky above the American formation, his aircraft's ammunition exhausted and his tactical doctrine in ruins. The bombers continued their steady progress toward their target, their defensive gunners scanning the sky for additional threats while maintaining their disciplined formation as if nothing significant had occurred. The radio chatter that filled Volker's headset during the flight back to base reflected the shock and confusion that this single engagement had created throughout the German fighter command structure. Reports from other squadrons indicated similar disasters occurring wherever German fighters encountered the new American bomber variants. Experienced pilots who had survived dozens of successful missions were being shot down in their first encounters with these redesigned defensive systems. Intelligence officers at Luftwaffe headquarters initially refused to believe the reports streaming in from surviving pilots. The idea that American bombers could mount 13 effective defensive positions seemed technologically impossible, and the reported accuracy and coordination of American gunners contradicted everything German intelligence believed about American aircrew training and tactical capability. Flight surgeons treating wounded German pilots who had survived encounters with the new American formations documented injuries that reflected the increased lethality of bomber defensive fire. Where previous combat wounds had typically resulted from single bullet hits or small shell fragments, pilots now arrived at German hospitals with multiple wounds from concentrated machine gun fire that had literally shredded their aircraft around them. The psychological impact on German fighter pilot morale was immediate and devastating. Men who had approached bomber interception missions with confidence and even enthusiasm now faced the terrifying reality that their proven tactical advantages had been not just neutralized but reversed. The hunters had become the hunted, and the mathematics of aerial combat now heavily favored the Americans. Aircraft maintenance crews at German fighter bases began documenting damage patterns that reflected the new reality of air combat over Europe. Where returning fighters had previously shown scattered bullet holes and minor structural damage, aircraft now returned so riddled with holes that ground crews often declared them total losses despite successful landings. The ammunition expenditure reports from American bomber formations told the story from the other perspective. B-17G crews were returning from missions having fired thousands of rounds in defensive actions that would have completely exhausted the ammunition supplies of earlier bomber variants. The sustained defensive fire that these new systems could maintain had transformed bomber formations from vulnerable targets into mobile fortresses capable of devastating any fighter force that attempted conventional attack methods. Training manuals at German fighter schools, which had been recently updated to incorporate lessons learned from successful bomber interception missions, suddenly became obsolete documents that described tactical situations which no longer existed. Instructors who had been teaching students to exploit specific weaknesses in American defensive systems now faced the reality that those weaknesses had been systematically eliminated through comprehensive redesign of both aircraft systems and crew training procedures. The strategic implications of this tactical transformation extended far beyond individual combat encounters. German Fighter Command had built its entire defensive strategy around the assumption that American bomber formations remained vulnerable to concentrated fighter attacks. If this assumption was no longer valid, the entire framework of Reich defense would require fundamental revision. Weather reconnaissance flights reported that American bomber formations equipped with the new defensive systems were maintaining tighter formations and showing less tendency to scatter when attacked. This formation discipline, combined with the devastating firepower now available to each aircraft, created defensive capabilities that seemed to increase exponentially rather than arithmetically. With each additional bomber in the formation, the radio intercept service documented changes in American bomber crew communications that reflected their increased confidence in their defensive capabilities. Where previous missions had featured urgent radio calls for fighter escort assistance and reports of heavy defensive casualties, crews now maintained professional communication discipline even during intensive fighter attacks. German pilots who had survived encounters with the new American formations began requesting transfers to other duties, citing not cowardice but simple mathematical reality.
the probability of survival in bomber interception missions had dropped from manageable risk levels to virtual certainty of death or capture. Even the most dedicated pilots could not ignore statistics that showed mission survival rates approaching zero.